My name is Isabelle McConville, and I'm a bookseller and associate producer here at Barnes Noble. And I am so excited to be here with Ron Currie, author of Everything Matters, Flimsy Little Plastic Miracles, The One-Eyed Man, and author of our March monthly pick, The Savage Noble Death of Babs Dionne. Ron, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here.
Can you first please set up the story of this novel for our listeners?
Oh gosh. So at the outset of the book, um, Babs Dionne is the title character is she lives and rules over a small town in Maine, the same town that I grew up in, Waterville, Maine, Central Maine. Most people know it for Colby College, if they know it at all. And um, she, over the course of her life, she's in her early 60s, and over the course of her life, she has bent um, all of the sort of functions of the municipality to her will. The
Mhm.
police, municipal government, and she is responsible for the drug trade in town. As the book begins, her youngest daughter Sis has gone missing,
Mhm.
and a mysterious stranger has come to town, and those two things do not seem at all coincidental, right? And it turns out that they're not. And so we follow Babs and her daughter Lori, her older daughter Lori. It's sort of a two-hander between them, right? Where
Mhm.
um, they're they can be fairly characterized as co-protagonists. And basically, as the story goes on, and not giving anything away by saying that Sis dies, right? We find out that Sis
Mhm.
has been killed. And so as we follow the story, what we're tracking is Lori trying to stay one step ahead of her mother, trying to
Mhm.
stay ahead of Babs. First in finding out that Sis is dead, Lori finds out first, and she's trying desperately to discover who's responsible before her mother does, because she knows her mother is going to burn the place to the ground, trying to exact revenge, right? And so that's what we follow over the course of the book. There's a lot else going on, but those are the broad strokes.
And it's such a fantastic novel. I had so much fun with this book, even though so much of it is very brutal.
Mhm.
The way that you write it, I mean, it was so easy to get attached to these characters, especially Lori. I really, really loved Lori. I wonder if you remember the initial spark for this book and how you knew that this was the one that you wanted to write.
Well, for me, and most of the novelists that I know, I think would agree with me on this. Story probably starts with character,
Hmm.
and it doesn't start necessarily with premise or um, or circumstance. It really starts with character. And so I grew up in a Franco-American neighborhood in Waterville, much like the one that Babs trolls, where everybody spoke French, including my parents. My father didn't speak English until he went to school. Um, Everybody went to church on Sundays, and it was a very um, insular community, in part because these these um, these sort of outposts of Francohood had established themselves because um, my forebears came down from Canada to work in the textile and paper mills in New England. And most of New England, if, as anybody who knows the basics of American history can tell you, is Protestant and English speaking, right? So we were automatically on the outside. So growing up in that neighborhood, um, my generation, I'm 50 years old now, and my generation was the one that straddled two really distinct periods. The period when Franco culture and language was still very much alive and vibrant, and the period now when it's almost entirely gone,
Mm.
because assimilation is absolute at this point. And as such, especially as I got older, the fact of having grown up in that environment started to feel like it started to feel unreal, because there's no evidence of its existence any longer. And
Mm.
so there was a point at which I started to characterize it as like a phantom limb, where it's gone, but you can feel it.
Yeah.
It itches, it hurts, it bothers you, it wants your attention. And for the longest time, I knew I wanted to write about that world, but I didn't have the right character. And then um, two things happened. So one was my aunt, my dad's sister, told me a story about how when she was a girl, when they were kids in the 50s, all the beat cops in Waterville had these big key rings that had all of the, you'll recognize this from the story, the big key ring that Sasha, the cop, carries
Yep.
that gave all the police access to all the businesses in town.
Hmm.
And but what she told me was at the time, the cops ostensibly were using these keys to check out to make sure that everything was on the up and up in these businesses. But really, what they were doing was taking whatever they wanted from these places. And so that was the first thing. She told me that they had an uncle who was a cop, and anytime that she got a gift from him for her birthday or for Christmas, she always knew it was stolen, even when she was like 8 years old. It was
Oh
just
my
common. It was
gosh.
just common knowledge, right?
Wow.
So there was that, and then there was a recovered memory that I had of my grandmother, my Meme Curry, my dad's mom, Rita, um, who I was very close with when I was little. And this thing that I remember must have happened when I was really young, like 5 or 6. I remember her taking somebody's cat and putting it in a clothes dryer and turning the dryer on.
Oh no.
Right. So in my memory, the cat was okay. But my grandmother was trying to make a point, and it was one of those moments where, like, I have no idea what the point was, but presumably it was made, right? Um, but it was one of those moments when we're really young, and I think we all have it sooner or later, regardless of how well we're taken care of, where you realize that these people who take care of you, the people responsible for protecting and raising you, they're not demigods, they're just people, and they
Yeah.
do messed up shit, and like it was that first moment of realization for me where she did this horrible thing that horrified me, that I found repulsive. um, but then with an adult perspective, I understood that she, like so many of the other women in Franco circles when I was a kid, and certainly in generations before, they had to be that tough, they had to be that sort of um, callous in order to usher their families through a world that was openly hostile to them.
Yeah.
And somehow those two things, the cops and the key rings and the stolen merchandise and my grandmother putting the cat in the clothes dryer, like I don't pretend to understand how novelist brains work, but I do know that those two things like combined wonder twin powers in my brain and they produced Babs. Suddenly she sprang forth like, from Zeus's head. And then I was off and running. And it's she to me, and I say this without any ego or taking any credit because I don't feel like I created her any more than I create anything else that I write. She was instantly iconic in my mind,
Hmm.
and she was so tough, so principled, um, willing to do. She had the courage of her convictions in a way that I've always wanted to, and have never succeeded at. She believes what she believes, and she acts accordingly, and even when it costs her, right?
Yeah.
And it costs her dearly. So once that character presented herself, the story just kind of falls into place. I know who she is. I know what her circumstances are. I know what she cares about. I know the degree to which, the lengths to which she will go to preserve her neighborhood, her culture, her language, her family. And the rest of it just kind of becomes details, when you have a character like that. And so it was a tremendous gift that I wasn't necessarily actively looking for. But once she presented herself, I was off and running, and the book didn't exactly write itself, but it went very quickly and came comparatively easily.
That's what I wanted to ask about too, because once you're given a gift like Babs, you have to write her.
Yeah.
That's from what I understand. I mean, you have to write a fantastic book about her, and you did. But I want to know more about what that writing process was like once you met Babs
Mm.
and, established who she is. How did that story pour out of you? Like, what did the rest of your writing process look like?
Well, I knew, um, you have like the circumstances of a story, particularly with a thriller, where the readers rightfully expect that there's going to be a rip roaring, like pass the popcorn kind of story going on. So you have the circumstances that you're setting up, and all of that is like um, toolbox stuff. Like I know how to give a character a problem that's going to be compelling to watch, whether or not they're able to resolve that problem, right? Like
Hmm.
I think about that sort of stuff um, in terms of my wife used to work on Capitol Hill for a long time, and one of the things that when you work on in Congress or other areas of the federal government, they do background checks, and what they're looking for are circumstances in your life that could be exploited by foreign agents,
Hmm.
right? So, do you have a lot of debt? Are you having an affair? These sorts of um, like broad vulnerabilities. And I realized in thinking about and hearing about the background checks that they put people through, those are precisely the sort of problems that as novelists, we want to give our characters because
Yeah,
you can exploit them, right? Like you can exploit them dramatically.
that's a funny way to think about it.
It lines up perfectly with what we do as novelists, and so there's that side of the writing of the book, right?
Hmm.
Which is all circumstantial and plot and all of that. And it's all there and it's all propulsive and exciting and really cool. But one of the things thematically that I was really interested in exploring was um, two things really. One, under what circumstances we will do the wrong things for the right reasons, right? Um, and um, how genuine, sort of unalloyed, pure distilled love can actually hurt people.
Mm.
Those are two broad thematic things that I was interested in exploring through this character, in part because as Babs's best friend and adopted sister says of her in the book, if you loved like she does, it would break you.
Hmm.
Um, and I was interested in that kind of love and the sort of dramatic possibilities and just the fact of it as human beings, like we do love that way, right? We do terrible things in the name of love, as
Hmm.
Babs does, and we love so imperfectly. Um, have you ever read A River Runs Through It? Uh,
No, no, I
Norman
haven't.
Maclean. Um, there's this wonderful line, and I think it's in the film as well, but um, he attributes it to his father, who was a Pentecost, not a Pentecostal, sorry. He was a preacher of some kind, some
Hmm.
denomination, and he's considering love and familial love in the wake of his son's death, Norman McLean's brother.
Hmm.
And what he says is, we can love completely without complete understanding. He's basically exploring the idea that like we always elude each other without even meaning to,
Mm.
and love has to be able to accommodate that, and that's something that I know it doesn't sound very thrillerish the way I'm talking about it right now, but that was something that I really wanted to dig down into and explore dramatically and dramatize.
Yeah, no, and you absolutely did. I mean, I can see that in this book. And I want to go to the incredible opening line that you have for this book. And I'd love if you could tell me a bit about writing it and what you wanted it to do for the reader.
I better check to see what it is.
I can read it out to
I
you.
know.
Um, think of generations as a chain, one link leading to and binding the next, and all of them, even the most distant, forever connected and inseparable.
I think I think what was really driving the decision to write that line and then for it to be the opening of the book was my own sense throughout my life of how I always considered, when I considered my forebears at all, they were always abstracted,
Mm-hmm.
you know, almost as if they weren't even real except insofar as they led to me. And I wanted to interrogate that feeling first of all, right? And push back on it a little bit, but also, when thinking about it in a broader, more philosophical way, it occurred to me that like I've always been fascinated, and if you've read Everything Matters or really any of my earlier work,
Mm-hmm.
you see this in there. I've always been fascinated by the notion of the butterfly effect,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where I wonder sometimes, and sometimes I do it out loud, which makes me wonderful fun at parties. I wonder sometimes about like how many times have I left the house 2 minutes early or 2 minutes late for my own death,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. Um, and in this case, it's sort of a larger contemplation than that, which is there was stuff that got cut from this prologue, the prelude, um, about like um, sort of trying to dramatize all the little tiny things, but also the big things that all create a timeline that leads to you, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I'm just fascinated by that. I don't. It's no more or less complicated than my own fascination with um, apocryphal stories about my great grandfather pulling his own teeth, his own rotten teeth with pliers after getting liquored up. You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And the ways in which we can connect to that stuff in our own lives, where like I never even met the guy, right? But then I had a molar that broke in half, and I couldn't get it pulled out for a couple of months, and it got infected.
Oh.
And those point being that the stories about him pulling his own teeth with pliers always seemed a little suspect to me until I had that problem and it got infected over a holiday weekend. And I was like, I get it now because I would absolutely pull this thing out if I could. Um, so the ways in which we can connect with people who we never met, will never know. Um, I don't know. I'm really in a lay person. Like I don't understand quantum physics or any of that stuff at all, except insofar as that I feel like I understand in an emotional way the way that time loops back on itself and sometimes goes straight up instead of in this direction and I find that really interesting dramatically in stories and so I wanted to figure out a different way to explore that and that's how I did it where like
Yeah.
this idea that we are not discrete people but rather the culmination of everything that preceded us, right?
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
something that we often will refer to, like the buzzy term these days is like generational trauma,
Yeah.
right? But to me, that's way too abstract. I want to think about like the choice that my great grandmother made, my great great grandmother made in the late 1800s. That if not for that thing that doesn't seem at all directly related to me, I wouldn't be here, right? So stuff like that.
I appreciated that you emphasized the way that, we think about our ancestors and how we mythologize them as if they weren't people like you and me, like people who are funny, people who, get tired at the end of the day, people who desire, people who can be mean and cruel and hurt. And we think of them as these older, wiser beings. I think a lot of us tend to, at least. I wonder if you can just talk a bit about why you think we do that and why it's easier to digest what came before us if we put distance there.
Mm. The second part of the question is more interesting and I think harder to answer. Um, why we do it, I don't know. I mean, to me, I think if we tried, it's like trying to imagine what a how many tennis balls it takes to fill the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the moment you start opening that door to those
Right.
sorts of contemplations, it becomes too much. You can't wrap your arms around it,
Yeah.
and so those abstractions, I think, serve a purpose. But it makes me think immediately of the sort of emotional distance that we place on children dying in Palestine. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yep.
um, where I have this thing, for some reason, it's always attached to Paris in my mind, but Paris isn't actually there unless I'm there.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And I think in it, if you dig into the physics deeply enough, you find out that in a sense that's actually true. Um, but I don't know. I think if we really, my guess is that if we exercised what we're talking about is the exercise of empathy, right?
Yes,
Across
yes.
generations, across time. I think if we opened up our empathic abilities, if we turned the dial to 10, it would be unbearable.
Hmm.
And so we create abstractions to protect ourselves. We create emotional and cognitive distance to protect ourselves from that pure, um, abiding, never-ending empathic response. It would be too much. And I think those of us who do, I've always had a really, um, for better and for worse, I've always had it's that aperture has always been wide open for me, which I think, serves me well as a writer and maybe not so well as a human being sometimes. Um, I think we spare ourselves a lot of personal suffering by keeping it turned down, maybe.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think that's true. But I think that our innate curiosity too for that comes out when we reach for books like this one, right? I think that we all have that question of what our ancestors could have been like, or want to close that gap. And I think that we look to writers like you to try and answer those questions for us.
I appreciate that, but my immediate thought is, isn't that just a form of self-interest or self-regard in a way? Like, why why theoretically would I care at all about my great grandmother except insofar as she's attached to me somehow,
Yeah,
right? So like,
yeah,
I don't know. I'm just
yeah,
sort of thinking out loud now, um, but yeah, I think it's a hard cognitive and emotional leap to make to empathize across time and across generations, but it also it hurts,
yeah,
right? It
yeah,
hurts me to think about what my great great grandparents went through,
yeah,
you know?
yeah,
It's easier not to think about it. It's certainly a lot easier to just leave it in the past and leave it as a notion that I don't really have to spend much time on.
yeah. I want to come back to Babs. When we meet her, she's working the counter at her uncle's store, standing by while people, namely cops, like we talked about a bit in the beginning, regularly steal from their store. And she thinks of this quote from Mercutio from Romeo and Juliet, "Oh, calm, dishonorable, vile submission." Can you
Mm,
talk to me about finding that quote, including it in the book, and why you wanted that to be really our first impression of Babs?
yeah. Um, well, because it's like so much of Shakespeare, um, it perfectly encapsulates all of the compromises, the assimilation,
Mm-hmm.
the yes sir, no sir, um, Franco-Americans' reputation as hard workers who never complained. Um, all of that is encompassed by that single line. Oh, calm, dishonorable, vile submission. Um, and I think about that a lot. Part of the reason I love Bab so much is because I wish somebody like her had existed and could have said, "No, we're not going to forget who we are. We're not going to stop speaking French." People don't. I mean, you have to understand. In Maine, there was a state law on the books until 1970 that made it illegal to speak French in public schools.
Wow.
When my grandmother was growing up in Waterville, the Klan was burning crosses outside of town. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
this was real stuff.
Yeah. And
And
not that
they
long ago.
no, I mean it's speaking of like anything that happened earlier than last week is an abstraction and somewhat unreal. But yes, it's only
Yeah.
2 3 generations back that we're talking about. So Franco-Americans' response, and I'm going to get myself into a lot of trouble saying this, but I'll say it anyway. Franco-Americans' response, by and large, to the pressures of an Anglo Protestant culture to assimilate was to do just that. Parents didn't pass they very deliberately didn't pass the language down to their kids.
Mm,
Um, you didn't want to tell anybody. I was just talking to a neighbor of mine who's an older fella. He's probably in his 70s. But when he was growing up, he was half French, and he understood almost intuitively that he didn't tell anybody about his French heritage. He would tell them about his Polish heritage, but not his French heritage. So imagine that being smack dab in the middle of that environment as Babs is, right? When it's still very palpable everywhere you go, and having Babs's general orientation toward the world and constitution, which is it's just not going to work for her, right?
Hmm.
So Mercutio's line is sort of it almost uh, it's like the spark that lights the fuse on who Babs becomes, right?
Yeah.
And actually, I realized so I've been working on a adaptation of the books for television,
Mm.
I realized I added something that's not in the book to one of the scripts where Babs she's doing a voiceover from when she's in her 60s and looking back on herself sitting in that classroom reading Romeo and Juliet, and the way that she refers to it as she says I use their own books to educate myself,
Mm.
right? So here's Shakespeare, it's an English writer. These stories have been passed down and perpetuated by Anglos, but she finds it and she finds what she needs as a Franco within that text to sort of
Yeah.
become who she is to be. And that was a moment of realization for me that I didn't have when I was writing the book, but she actually sees it as using their own books against them, right? That
Yeah.
um, also I just love that line, and I love Mercutio. He's such a badass. And talk about somebody who, I mean, you can have a conversation about whether Mercutio is courageous or reckless, right? But like he was somebody who had the courage of his convictions, and
Yeah.
again, and paid for it the way we usually do in stories, especially in tragedies, which is
I'm glad that you drew that line between him and Babs, though. I thought that was such an interesting parallel. And so I wanted, yeah, I'm glad that you told me a bit about why you chose that line because I also just I love Shakespeare, and so that this is
Mercutio's a little more fun than Babs is, probably at least on the
sure.
surface. But I think they share a spirit, you know.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I would love to switch gears for a second and talk about Lori. If you could tell me a bit about how you really came to find her voice. We learned that she struggles with PTSD. She was a Marine. She was
Don't
stationed.
tell her that.
Yes, this is true. And she was stationed in Afghanistan, and she actually can see ghosts. So
Mhm.
I wonder if you can talk to me a bit about Lori, her seeing ghosts, and what you were doing with that.
Yeah. So Lori, the relationship between Lori and Babs has always been that classic one of um, being cut from the same cloth.
Yep.
This town's not big enough for the two of us, sort of thing. You know, I mean, it really is. Like when Lori looks at her mother, she's looking in a mirror, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Um, Lori's probably the only person who is on a level with Babs in terms of raw toughness. So they're foils in a way. Um, so Lori wanted to get out of town as quickly as she could, and she enlisted in the Marines before the ink was dry on her high school diploma, and she was gone for 10 years. Um, and then she came home, and she came home in part because her father had died, and this is a recurring theme with Babs as well, right? Where she needs help and she doesn't even recognize it, let alone ask for it. But
Hmm.
Lori recognized that her mother needed help with her father gone. And so even though everything in her wanted nothing to do with certainly the family business or being in Waterville anymore, and she herself was a wreck, she's an addict. Um, she's got all kinds of stuff that she's dealing with. Um, she's still, to me, that her decision to come home and stay home and engage in all these things that she would much rather chew broken glass than do. um, it's an exploration of the limits of like filial responsibility, right? Like
Yeah.
what do we owe to the people in our family broadly, and what do we owe to our parents more specifically? And as with most dramatic questions that are worth anything, there's no answer, right? The answer is embedded in what happens between these particular people, but it's not the answer.
Yeah.
Um, and in Laurie's case, um, there is ultimately almost no limit because she's learned from the master how to love. Absolutely, without exception. Even when
Hmm.
they want you, even when they say, really, no, 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 you don't have to love me anymore. Keep loving them. Um, love them to death in some cases. And, as far as the ghosts are concerned, excuse me, um, that was you can look at the ghost, Laurie's ability to see ghosts in a number of different ways, some of which are made explicit in the book, and some are just sort of implied. But
Hmm.
like one of those ways is really straightforward in my mind, which it's just dramatized grief. I
Yeah.
and I suspect that the very idea of ghosts sprung from whatever cave dwelling hominid first experienced what we think of as grief.
Yeah.
That was the moment that the idea of ghosts was created because that's what it feels like, right?
Yeah.
Grieving, especially long term, feels like being haunted. And so I wanted that aspect of it to just give it. But the thing about grief in a story, as in real life, is that it's not terribly dramatic in and of itself. It happens
Hmm.
entirely internally, um, and only you as you can share it. Right? I'm grieving, but that's not the same. Um, so there's that aspect of it. But then the other thing that's more culturally based that I wanted to get into was I'm sure you've read Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Hmm.
The version of Catholicism in his books that has that super, like, there's a pagan element to it that's
Yeah.
unmistakable. That was the version when I first read Garcia Marquez, I recognized that version of Catholicism right away as the same Catholicism we practiced when I was a kid. It was like, yeah, God and Jesus and all that stuff, but also like, did you see that fox over there? What it was doing? Like, there's this essential um, pagan element at the center of it that I've never really seen represented outside of really South American fiction, Central American fiction.
Hmm.
Um, so the ghosts are kind of, and the fox in the book as well, the fox god that Laurie encounters and then makes an appearance at the end,
Hmm.
are sort of elements of that. Um, you know, Christianity hard as it tried to stamp out every last vestige of paganism,
Yeah.
didn't succeed. And because we ultimately are still the same crazy animals, house apes that we've always been, and we're pagans, right? We want to bark at the moon.
Hmm.
We want to dance around fire, and those were the vectors by which I wanted to represent that in the book.
Yeah, I also want to talk to you about Maine itself.
Hmm.
Obviously, you grew up there and you live there and work there now. What is it about Maine that keeps you coming back? And how
That's
has,
a very good question. I have no
yeah,
idea, especially in February. I don't know.
yeah, I'm so curious because I have such a thing for, people in their home states. Like I grew up in Florida and I live in New York now, and I
Yeah.
have a very complicated relationship with Florida. So I'm always interested to hear about, if you stay where you grew up, why and what makes you want to write about it? And
Hmm.
also, how do you think your relationship with Maine has changed?
Mm. There's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah.
I lived in Florida, by the way, back in the ancient times in the mid 90s.
Oh, wow.
And I feel the same about Florida as I feel about Maine in a way. But
Hmm.
there's something deeply strange going on in the landscape,
Yeah.
um, that's sort of ineffable almost. But you've seen other writers do a good job of capturing it, or at least you know casting a light on it.
Yes.
I think of Lauren Groff or no, Swamplandia, Karen Russell.
Oh, yes, Karen Russell. Absolutely.
Um, anyway, uh, so Maine. I mean, the really focused answer to this question is that I grew up in central Maine, and Babs. sort of articulates through her thoughts my view of the difference between coastal Maine and interior Maine, right? Like coastal Maine is the part of Maine that everybody that's in the popular imagination. It's like lobster boats and lighthouses and rocky
Hmm.
coast, and it's quaint and cute accents and all that stuff. Um, when I was growing up in central Maine, we didn't have any money. We never went to the beach. I might as well have been in Nebraska as
Hmm.
far as my relationship with the ocean was concerned, right? And so it's a very different world, and I think I always sort of had a chip on my shoulder about it. Honestly, still kind of do. I like to think that I've reduced the size of the chip, but it's still there. So I wanted to very simply to create a story and raise the visibility of that part of the state, mountain country, timber country,
Right.
the places where Francos went and toiled and lived and raised families and died, and um, so there's that part of it. Um, I guess who was it? Flannery O'Connor said, if you survive to 18, you've got all the material you'll need to write for a lifetime. I mean,
Yep.
I don't pretend to understand why that is, but it's indubitably true. Like those, for a writer at least, and actually, Father Clement talks about this in the book where I forget the context in which it comes up. Father Clement, of course, being Babs's best friend
Right.
and the man who rescued her after the thing that happens between her and Sasha.
Right.
Um, but he talks about administering to the dying and how they always want to go back to the house they grew up in and take a look around.
Hmm.
Um, there's something about I think most novelists, maybe not most novelists, but certainly those who write about the places and the people they grew up around, we're trying forever to close that circuit in some way,
Yeah.
in the same way that somebody who's dying of a terminal illness going to the house they grew up in, they're trying to close some sort of circuit, right? Um, and all of us are attempting to do that without understanding how or if it can even be accomplished. But there's some real like primal drive to like return and understand. That doesn't happen to you when you're 30,
Yeah.
and so that's home, right?
Yeah.
With all that implies. And um, for me, my relationship with Maine is complicated. I can remember my father telling me when he was around my age that he was just done with the winters here.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way. But in the second Babs book, Babs has um, an argument with some rich guy who lives. He's the vice president of international paper, and he lives in this beautiful compound on the coast that I modeled after the Bush family's compound down in Kennebunk. Um, and she says to him something along the lines of like, "You think you can just you don't understand that you have to earn the summers here. You think you can just buy them."
Oh, yeah.
There's something I think very real about you don't really understand and appreciate the summers here. That's the 6 week period when everything is perfect, unless you suffer through the 6 month period when everything sucks.
Yep.
And so there's some aspect of that in the book too.
Yeah, absolutely. After I read this book, I went back and I read a piece that you did for Electric Literature called The Grotesque Cruelty of Human Nature, where you
Oh God,
revisit David Foster Wallace's essay, Consider the Lobster,
yeah.
through the lens of the Maine Lobster Festival. I just wanted to ask you if there, how that piece relates to your book because you have this great quote from the piece. I'll read it out to you. Consider the lobsters about the wholesale pain we as a species inflict on ourselves and creation, and how we turn a blind eye to that pain so we can keep eating and doing whatever we want. I think
Mm.
we can see that in Babs, but I want your perspective on that.
um, I didn't see this coming. Uh, you do your research.
I
Um,
am also just a fan, genuinely, and I love that piece.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, it's from the heart for sure. And sort of like stripped down and absolutely naked and like, just like, this is what it is. It's not
Yeah.
pretty. Um, how that sort of view informs the book,
Yeah.
or
If it does at
Babs's
all.
character.
Hmm.
I think Babs, I think you could, there's a strain of antinatalism that runs through her, despite the fact that she has kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe because she has kids. Maybe it's a late arriving antinatalism. But the idea that, and for those listeners or viewers who don't know what antinatalism is, another popular subject at parties in my experience, the the idea that life is better not lived, basically, right? Like, and to bring something into this world, a child, obviously, is an act of cruelty,
Hmm.
um, on balance.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I think antinatalism probably runs through Babs and through her convictions about how one should live,
Yeah.
um, how one should be in relation to the world, and I think most people who are anti-nihilists, and I consider myself one, uh, would tell you that the notion or the conviction springs from a place of, that we were talking about, the aperture, the empathetic aperture of that being wide open all the time,
Hmm.
which may not actually be an accurate view of how other people experience the world, right?
Yeah.
Um, but but that's how it feels to me, and so like I'm going to stick around because I like the Constitution for suicide, basically. But like I don't want to do this to anybody else.
Yeah.
And I think that shines through in Babs,
Yeah.
both in her attitude towards her enemies, but also in she's capable of sort of stunning kindness too. Um, and to me, that the wellspring of that is an understanding of what it is to suffer,
Yeah.
and a deep, almost reflexive desire not to inflict suffering on somebody certainly who somebody who doesn't deserve it. Um, she's not above making people suffer. She feels like they've earned it, but yeah.
I think about that piece a lot when I read your other books as well, because I like that how you point out that in Consider the Lobster, David Foster Wallace isn't necessarily coming to a conclusion. He's just raising the question of suffering. And I think that you do that in your work as well.
I come by it honestly, and I appreciate that you. I mean, it's probably this central, and again, this doesn't sound very thrillerish, does it? Does it? But like, it's the central narrative preoccupation of my work, I think,
Yeah.
where and it encompasses everything. It encompasses everything that I was taught about God. It encompasses everything that I was taught in school. That encompasses like what, um, this idea that one of the ways in which I've sold or talked about the Babs' story in Hollywood circles is she's sort of, I came up with this concept of, heroic futility is what I call it.
Mm.
That's what life feels like to me, right? Like it's this zero sum game, contest against entropy that none of us can ever win. And the meaning and the beauty of it, insofar as it exists, is completely embedded in the struggle. It's got nothing to do with outcomes, right? Because we know what the outcome is.
Yeah.
And so we see that in I mean, it's called The Savage Noble Death of Babs Dionne, right?
Hmm.
We know what's going to happen. But you see that in all kinds of other really famous, iconic narratives. And I think a big part of the reason they are famous and iconic is precisely because of that element. So, like, whether it's
Yep.
Thelma and Louise driving off the cliff in the Thunderbird, right? That's heroic futility in a nutshell. Butch and Sundance running out of the mission into a hail of bullets. That's heroic futility. Rocky at the end of the first Rocky movie, when he and Adrian are rejoicing in the ring, as you hear in the background that he lost the fight. that's heroic futility. And I think we all understand, whether we acknowledge it to ourselves or not, we all understand that that is the struggle that we're engaged in this
Yeah,
life, you know? And
that's
so
so.
I'm obsessed with it. And I keep trying to traumatize it in any number of different ways. This is just the latest, you know?
I'm glad you do because we get great books out of it.
Gosh, I hope so.
Speaking of, we aren't quite done with Babs. There's another book coming in July called We Will See You Bleed. Can you talk to me about that next book? Anything you can say and why you knew you wanted to stick with Babs?
Well, I cheated, obviously, because um, Babs dies at the end of this book, the first book,
Mm.
but she's back. And the way that she's back is that the second book is set in 1984. The first book's 2016,
Yep.
second book's 1984. The third book, which I'm working on now, will be contemporaneous, and it follows Lori and her daughter, who we meet at the end of the first book, right?
Fun.
Um, but regarding the second book, it's called "We Will See You Bleed," and it's at the beginning of the book. There's a paper mill strike that's been dragging on for about a year, and I modeled this strike after an actual strike that occurred in 1987 at a place called Jay, Maine, um, which is still famous in labor circles. Um, and so Babs is the head of. She's not a criminal yet. She's the head of the local Teamsters union, or Teamsters local, and she has sworn off of violence after her experience with Sasha in the first book.
Yeah.
And she comes to realize, um, through events in the second book, that they're all, whether it's the strike or whether it's being a good worker bee and paying your taxes and staying on the right side of the law, it's all a rigged game that they can never win.
Yeah.
And so she comes to understand, this is the way in which she becomes the person we meet in the first book, which is the person who says, I'm not playing a rigged game.
Yeah.
I'm going to do what I have to do. I'm going to color outside the lines, to live the life that I want to live. And so we see her go through that process over the course of this second book. Um, it's a bit broader and more lived in than the first book. I think there's obviously a more stronger sense of the historical context, labor context, ethnic context that informs the first book as well, but is in the more distant past. But it also is, it's very much a thriller. And I'll tell you, so at the end of the first book, you might remember when Babs and Rita are talking as the fire is drawing closer. And Babs makes mention of 500 pounds of TNT that her
Yes.
husband got. We're going to see that 500 pounds of TNT in the second book.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah. So just that, lest anybody should think that it's not also just a ridiculous story. Yeah, that 500 pounds of explosives will be present in the second book.
I can't wait for that.
It's fun.
Ron, thank you so much for being here today. I am patiently awaiting We Will See You Bleed in July, but I hope everyone goes and grabs their copy of The Savage Noble Death of Babs Dionne. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It was my distinct pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.